So I do a lot of different content on this channel, but probably the most requested video of all time is please do another Shadowrun lore. So you better fucking watch this, otherwise I'm gonna be mad. I'm also a huge idiot, and I forgot to link the straw poll for the Amsterdam meetup on the 12th of September this year of our Lord 2019 in the description or comment section, as I had announced that I would put it. Said I went out on a boat and watched fireworks on the fjord. So I've put the straw poll there now in the last video with the announcements. I'm also going to put it in the comments of this video and pin it, and then you can basically do the thing. But let's talk about Shadowrun. Extraterritoriality is a super duper cyberpunk concept, and we're gonna get tied up in the legalese of it soon enough. But first, you might be surprised to know that it's actually something that exists in the real world right now and has existed for quite some time. The idea of extraterritoriality is that to certain areas and individuals within a country's borders, the laws of that country do not apply. Instead, the laws of whatever nation state that individual or place is an extraterritorial extension of apply. And I say individual because persons is usually what extraterritoriality is applied to in the modern world. There's this misconception that embassies are the sovereign territory of whatever state they belong to, but that is almost always not the case. The US Embassy in Berlin is not American soil, it is on German soil. And I'm not certain about that specific building, but most of the time embassies are also not strictly speaking themselves extraterritorial, but the people inside them are. And for some of those people, most notably the ambassadors themselves, that extraterritoriality also applies when they are outside of the embassy. So if the German ambassador to the United States wanted to go out in Washington, D.C. and drink alcohol in public on the streets, she could do that, because even though it's illegal under US law, it's perfectly legal under German law. Even though she is located in the United States, she is not subject to United States law, but German law. This is where diplomatic immunity comes from. A country cannot prosecute a diplomat by their own laws, but they can evict them, which is a pretty big deal. When it comes to just sort of areas being extraterritorial, that's actually a lot more common for military bases, but there are some other examples. For instance, the Vatican owns a lot of properties all over Italy, and a lot of them are considered to be extraterritorial. The CERN Institute is located in Switzerland, but parts of it extend into France, but they're still governed by Swiss law. Extraterritoriality can also make it so international law applies to certain areas or individuals within a country, such as, for instance, the UN buildings in New York and other places of the world. Conversely, interestingly enough, when you have a ship that's in international waters where international law would apply, it can be that this ship is an extraterritorial entity of whatever country it is a part of, so that country's laws apply. There was a very interesting case of flash extraterritoriality in Canada in 1943, where the Canadian government declared the maternity ward of Ottawa Civic Hospital to be extraterritorial, and thus having international law apply to it for a few hours. The reason for this was that Princess Margaret of the Netherlands was currently in the process of being born there, and because the family was currently living in exile from the Nazis who had occupied the Netherlands. And because no one wanted to run the risk of, however unlikely it may have eventually been, having a Canadian citizen sitting on the Dutch throne, the government decided to suspend the laws that governed that particular area of Canadian soil that would have made her a Canadian citizen for having been born in Canada, and thus, according to international law, she would derive her citizenship from her mother, who was Dutch. In Shadowrun, these kinds of interesting legal tricks are exactly the kind of shit that extraterritoriality is used for, just, you know, like a lot shadier. In essence, many corporations in Shadowrun, notably the mega corporations, are sovereign states that do not own any sovereign land. I mean, they have corporate citizenship and everything. There's people who are only citizens of a corporation and not citizens of a nation state and a corporation. They have their own law enforcement, they have their own courts, and so naturally, acting as a government in more ways than one, they also have the ability to make their own laws. laws. By the way, the extraterritoriality thing also applies on the individual level to high-level executives of most of these corporations. So when they go around places, they are considered extraterritorial entities, much like diplomats have diplomatic immunity. As you might imagine, the megacorps use this kind of stuff to sort of have like laboratories where they conduct gruesome experiments, or places where they basically keep slaves, or like any other thing that a modern nation state might be appalled of. You know, like maybe certain governments in our modern world that are international superpowers, some would say the prime superpower, maintain certain prisons on certain Caribbean islands where they have certain laws of their own country that don't apply there, and so they can do things there that are actually illegal under their own law. But how did it even come to pass that in Shadowrun somehow private corporations got the ability to have their own laws and then enforce their own laws and do so on the sovereign soil of various nation states? Well, for that, we're gonna have to go back to like 2001 in the Shadowrun timeline, specifically the Supreme Court case of the Shiawase Corporation versus the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Some years earlier, in 1997, Shiawase had constructed an aluminium factory in California. This wasn't a small beans bakery. This was like a massive, huge super factory that way overstrained the municipal power grid and sort of created blackouts all the time and massively drove up the price of energy. So Shiawase decided it would probably be cheaper to just have a teeny tiny nuclear reactor on the grounds of the factory. And, you know, being the law-abiding corporation that they of course are, they filed for a permit with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to construct that nuclear reactor. And the NRC said, wait, hold on, you want to build a reactor at this factory with like no research purposes and no commercial purposes of you selling energy back to the grid, but you want to do it only to power this one factory? No, is the thing. That hard pass. Like, the environmental hazards, way too big, and it really doesn't provide much of a public benefit. But Shiawase contested this decision and took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where they were definitively given the right to build their nuclear reactor. We'll come back to this in a minute, but first, let's take a look at another Supreme Court case from 1999. In 1998, the Teamsters Union in New York went on strike, because they're the Teamsters Union and they always have a reason to go on strike. Negotiations went on for way longer than had been expected, and the thing about New York City in particular is that there's a lot of people there, and that there's not a lot of agriculture there. So if the people who transport food into the city are not working because they're on strike, there's no food in the city. And if there's no food in the city, people get mad. One of the main corps transporting food into New York City was Ceratec, or rather its subsidiary Ceratec Transport. So when New Yorkers saw a Ceratec refrigeration truck drive through Staten Island one day, they just sort of assumed that it was transporting food, because that's what you use a refrigeration truck for most of the time. So naturally, they formed an angry mob and assaulted it. Thing is, the truck was not actually transporting, you know, food, but like dangerous medical waste, which, if released in New York City, could have potentially caused a global pandemic. And the security personnel on that truck knew this. So when the truck was eventually halted and it seemed like there was no way out of this situation but using lethal force, they began using lethal force, and they managed to bring the truck to a facility in New Jersey, which was then besieged by rioters because they thought that there was food in there that they weren't giving out. Listen, hungry people, not really rational. Couple hundred people died. Some of them were actually, you know, Ceratec employees. Most of them weren't. But if containment had been breached and they had actually opened the truck, like, a lot more people would have died. So essentially, the security personnel were kind of heroes. This led to a protracted series of court cases, and in 1999, the Supreme Court eventually decided that private corporations were allowed to maintain their own regulated militias in order to provide security for themselves and the public. Man, Courts worked fast back then, didn't they? But back to Shiawase and their nuclear reactor. Very few people were, happy with the location of the nuclear reactor because it was an environmental hazard, but a group that was especially pissed off was an environmentalist bioterrorist group called Terra First. Terra First decided they would put together a strike team and then go to the reactor and do damage there. And they did, and the area was contaminated with bad green juju, also known as nuclear waste. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was super happy about this, actually, because it meant that they could sue Shiawase for their gross negligence, especially considering that after the Siratech decision, they had the right and responsibility to maintain a private security army to have security in those facilities that is appropriate. Little did they know that Shiawase had a crack team of lawyers with a great strategy. Basically, they managed to prove that they could have defended the facility with the personnel and security measures that had been in place at the facility. However, regulations imposed by the NRC and the state and federal law prevented them from doing so. So basically, it wasn't Shiawase's fault, it was the government's fault. So eventually, the Supreme Court decided that Shiawase was allowed to operate most aspects of the aluminium plant as well as the nuclear power plant that was attached to the aluminium plant without being subject to US regulations, specifically in matters of security. This essentially opened the door for extraterritoriality in the United States, and every massive corporation with $5 to spare for a lawyer essentially just went ahead and made all of their shit extraterritorial with regards to the precedents set by Shiawase v. NRC 2001. And though it only started in the United States, extraterritoriality for corporations became the hot shit all over the world very soon, and more nations and corporations were getting into it. Ultimately, legislation was drawn up, executive decisions made, and corporate extraterritoriality just became a thing that happened. It was, however, a massive clusterfuck of different overlapping jurisdictions and various regulations changing from sometimes municipality to municipality, and while the lawyers were very happy about that, it sometimes did interfere with business. Thankfully, by 2023, corporations were already just about as powerful as governments, and so 7 of them decided to form the corporate court. Because here's the thing, right? When you have disputes between sovereign states and extraterritorial entities that are located on those sovereign states, but they're extraterritorial, or maybe between different extraterritorial entities, or maybe disputes of sovereign states over extraterritorial entities, whose laws are you going to follow? The corporate court became a powerful body of arbitration between such entities in such cases, and they were housed in a fancy space station called Zurich Orbital. In 2073, the corporate court became officially recognized by nation-states and corporations around the world as the primary arbitration body in disputes over extraterritorial entities and between extraterritorial entities as part of the Business Recognition Accords. A lot of extraterritoriality law was standardized, a lot of contracts renegotiated, a lot of, disputes arbitrated. Some countries did not sign the Business Recognition Accords, such as, Amazonia, or the Tiers, or Aztlan, which is super ironic, considering that its technology has a seat on the corporate court. Scandinavian Union signed it, but only with special provisions being made, much like Britain when it joined the EU. Ultimately, even most nations that haven't signed the Business Recognition Accords have some form of extraterritoriality, and the nations that have signed the Business Recognition Accords also handle their way of doing extraterritoriality a little different. In France, for instance, there are certain law enforcement agencies that have the right to enforce French law on extraterritorial entities in very specific cases, and they also have to let them know ahead of time. Usually that results in all the illegal stuff not happening there anymore. In the Confederate American States, extraterritorial holdings are subject to court decisions in regards to environmental regulations. They even have a whole agency that takes care of the extraterritorials not doing any bad stuff with the environment, which is a bit difficult because they can't, you know, go there and check the bad things that they are doing. So yeah, basically, extraterritoriality in Shadowrun allows megacorporations to essentially act as their own sovereign nation states that operate all over the world without actually having, like, sovereign soil. Thank you very much for watching this Shadowrun lore video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. I actually wanted to do one on Metropole. I've been wanting to do that one for a long time, but I'm going to release it in tandem with the novella that I'm working on that is set in Metropole, but it's a very difficult and arduous process. In the meantime, maybe buy some merch or don't buy some merch and save the money to buy the book of mine that is not going to have this ugly banderole when it comes out on the 6th of July. In that spirit, go play some Shadowrun and see you around, cunts.